All right, so get ready because today we are going deep into the biology of sex and gender. We are going to untangle the science behind it all, and believe me, it is a fascinating journey with a lot of unexpected twists and turns.
It definitely is. Yeah, I've spent my career kind of at this intersection of behavior and neuroscience, and the more we learn about sex and gender, the more complex and intriguing it becomes.
For sure. To start things off, let's talk about hormones. We
Mhm.
always hear about how they influence behavior, but how much control do they actually have over our sexual behavior?
Yeah, it's not just like hormones are calling the shots. It's more like a really complex kind of a dance. So take testosterone, for example. It's often labeled the male hormone, and it does have an influence on sexual motivation and behavior in both men and women. But here's where things get interesting. Studies have shown that testosterone levels can actually surge in women after sexual activity, just like they do in men.
Really? So our actions can influence our hormone levels. That's a pretty powerful loop. It makes you wonder about the whole chicken and the egg situation.
Exactly. It really highlights this interplay between hormones and behavior. It's not just one direction.
That complicates things. So when we talk about sex determination, it's clearly more than just a simple hormone check.
Absolutely. And the case of Caster Semenya, the South African Olympic runner, really brought this complexity into the spotlight. She faced a lot of scrutiny and controversy because her naturally high testosterone levels challenged those traditional notions of what defines female in competitive sports. And it really sparked huge ethical debates about fairness and the very definition of sex in a sporting context.
I remember that. That case definitely raised a lot of tough questions about how we define sex and the implications for individuals who don't fit neatly into those categories. So let's switch gears for a second and talk about the brain. I've heard this idea of certain brain structures being masculinized by hormones during development. How does that work?
So it all boils down to this process called aromatization. Essentially, what happens is during fetal development, testosterone can be converted into estradiol, which is a form of estrogen, within certain neurons. And believe it or not, it's actually estradiol that plays a key role in shaping those, what we call masculine brain structures.
Wait, so the male hormone is transforming into a female hormone to make parts of the brain more male-like? That's pretty mind-blowing. I mean, it makes you wonder about the implications for people with different gender identities.
You're hitting on a critical point there. The journey from prenatal hormone exposure to brain development and ultimately to gender identity is super complex, and we are still trying to piece together all the puzzle pieces.
And is there even a clear biological basis for something as personal and nuanced as gender identity? I mean, can science really explain that?
That is a question that's really at the forefront of research. And while there is still a lot that we don't know, we do know that prenatal hormone exposure can have a significant impact on brain development. And it's not just about the levels of hormones present, but also the timing and how the developing brain is exposed to them during these really critical periods. These early influences can have long-lasting impacts on an individual's later sense of self and gender identity.
So those early stages are super crucial. I mean, it's like setting the foundation for a building.
Hmm.
If that's not solid, it can affect the whole structure.
Yeah.
To make this a little more concrete, could you maybe share a real-life example that illustrates how these biological factors can impact gender identity?
Sure. The story of Jan, who transitioned to Jack, is a really good example. So he was born with female anatomy, but experienced a significant shift during puberty. So his voice deepened, he developed male musculature, and even his external genitalia started to change. And eventually, doctors discovered he actually had undescended tests, a condition that went unnoticed during his early years. And this led Jan to transition to Jack and undergo surgery to align his physical characteristics with his gender identity.
That's amazing how these biological factors, sometimes hidden or unexpected, can have such a huge impact on someone's life. And it really highlights the importance of listening to individuals' experiences and respecting their sense of self.
Couldn't agree more. And it really drives home the fact that we can't simply dismiss these biological aspects of gender as unimportant or secondary to social influences.
So where does all this leave us in this age-old debate of nature versus nurture? Is it even the right way to frame it when talking about something as complex as gender?
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely not a simple either situation. The truth is, both our genes and our environment really interact to shape who we are, including our gender identity and expression. Think of it like a really beautifully woven tapestry. Threads of biology and experience are kind of intertwining to create this unique and complex whole.
Wow, my brain is buzzing from all these insights.
Hmm.
It is amazing how much we are learning about the biology of sex and gender. And speaking of learning, let's talk about this junk DNA. I vaguely remember it from like high school biology, but it seems like scientists are starting to unravel its mysteries. So how does this junk DNA fit into this whole puzzle of sex and gender?
Oh, that's a great question. So for years, scientists dismissed the majority of our DNA as junk because it didn't code for proteins, the building blocks of life. But as it turns out, this non-coding DNA is far from useless. Think of it like an instruction manual for our genes, like this complex control panel that kind of determines which genes get switched on or off and to what extent.
So it's not just about the genes themselves, but how their activity is controlled by this junk DNA. That's pretty wild. I mean, does that mean that creatures with more complex behaviors like us humans would have more of this conductor DNA compared to, say, a worm?
That's a very interesting question, and some researchers do believe that there might be a connection there. So while the number of protein-coding genes might not directly correlate with behavioral complexity, like a roundworm, for example, has almost as many protein-coding genes as a human. But the amount of non-coding DNA does seem to correspond. So it suggests that the complexity of our behavior, including our experiences of sex and gender, might be influenced by these very intricate ways that our genes are regulated.
Wow, it really is like peeling back the layers of an onion. Each layer reveals more complexity. It makes you wonder about the role of heredity in all this. We inherit traits from our parents, but how does that work when it comes to things like personality or maybe even, predispositions towards certain gender identities?
Heredity is a fascinating topic. It's incredibly complex.
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that we inherit predispositions, not destinies. So our genes might make us more susceptible to certain traits or behaviors, but they don't determine our fate. And this is true for both, physical and psychological characteristics, including aspects of gender identity and expression.
So it's like genes provide a blueprint, but our environment and our experiences are like the architects, shaping that final structure. So it's not a fixed plan, but a starting point with like a lot of room for variation. So is there a way to kind of measure that relative influence of heredity versus environment?
There is. It's called heritability, and it basically measures how much of the variation in a trait within a population can be attributed to genetic factors. So a higher heritability would mean that genes play a bigger role, while a lower heritability suggests a stronger environmental influence.
That makes sense. It's a way to quantify things,
Yeah.
but it's still operating at a population level, right? What about individuals? How much does heritability actually tell us about a single person?
You bring up a very important point. While heritability estimates can give us these insights at a population level, they don't predict outcomes for individuals. So even for traits with very high heritability, the environment still plays this crucial role in how those genes are expressed.
So someone might have a genetic predisposition towards something, but their environment and experiences could significantly influence how that trait shows up, or even if it shows up at all. It's that interplay between nature and nurture again. It's like having all the ingredients for a cake, flour, sugar, eggs, but that final product, it all depends on the recipe and the baker.
That is a great analogy. And just to add another layer of complexity here, keep in mind that heritability estimates, they can vary depending on the population that is being studied and the environment they live in. So it's not like this fixed number. It's a dynamic measure that really reflects that interplay of genes and environment.
This is all so fascinating. I'm starting to realize that understanding these complexities of biology, from genes to hormones to brain development, is crucial for creating a more inclusive and supportive society, especially for individuals who identify or express their gender in ways that don't fit those traditional norms.
I completely agree. This knowledge is absolutely essential for fostering empathy, respect, and a deeper understanding of all the diverse ways humans can experience and express themselves.
It feels like we are challenging some deeply ingrained assumptions about sex and gender, moving away from these rigid categories and kind of embracing a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of human diversity.
Absolutely. We are definitely moving beyond the binary and recognizing that spectrum of human experience when it comes to sex and gender.
Okay, I have one last burning question about all this talk of heredity and predispositions. Are there scientifically demonstrable differences between male and female brains? I mean, we are bombarded with all these ideas about how men and women think differently, but how much of that is actually rooted in biology versus, like, societal conditioning?
That is a question that has fueled countless debates and research studies. And while it's important to be careful about reinforcing stereotypes that could be harmful, there is some scientific evidence for certain cognitive and behavioral differences between men and women.
Now, what are we talking about here? What kind of differences?
For example, research has shown that, on average, men tend to perform better on tasks that involve spatial reasoning, like mentally rotating objects or navigating through a maze. On the other hand, women often do better in verbal fluency and memory tasks.
So those stereotypes about men being better at maps and women remembering every detail might actually have some basis in reality. But why would those differences even exist?
Well, one theory, and it is an interesting one, points to our evolutionary history. Think about the traditional roles in those hunter-gatherer societies. Men were often the hunters, which required strong spatial skills to track prey and navigate through unfamiliar territory. Women, on the other hand, were often responsible for gathering food and caring for children, tasks that probably favored strong verbal and social skills.
So over many generations, those different demands might have shaped how our brains developed, leading to those cognitive differences. But is it all about evolution, or are there maybe other factors at play here?
It's very likely a combination of factors. Evolution might have laid the groundwork, but our experiences and environment also shape our cognitive abilities. And of course, we can't forget about cultural expectations and societal norms. It is important to remember that we are talking about averages here, not absolutes. Not every man is going to be a master navigator, and not every woman will have a photographic memory.
Right. We're talking about statistical trends, not hard and fast rules. There is so much variation within each sex that it is important to avoid those sweeping generalizations about individuals. It's like saying men are from Mars and women are from Venus, but really we are all from Earth with a lot more in common than we like to think.
I like that. We are all part of the same human family, each with our own unique set of strengths and abilities.
Okay, before we wrap this up, I have one more question that I know is kind of a sensitive topic, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on it. What about sexual orientation? I know there's been a lot of misunderstanding and prejudice, but I am wondering what science has to say about its biological basis.
It's a complex topic for sure, and a sensitive one, but scientific research is really starting to shed light on the biological factors that may contribute to sexual orientation. It's an area that's been surrounded by a lot of misinformation and stigma for too long, but we are making progress.
So what are some of the leading theories right now in this area?
Well, one area of focus is on genetics. Studies with twins have shown that there is a higher concordance rate for homosexuality in identical twins compared to fraternal twins, which suggests that genes might play a role.
That makes sense. Identical twins share 100% of their genes, while fraternal twins share only about 50%. So a higher concordance rate for identical twins does point to some genetic influence. But are genes the whole story, or are there other biological factors involved?
There is also some evidence that prenatal hormone exposure could play a role. For instance, some studies have shown that men with older brothers are more likely to be homosexual. One theory suggests this might be due to changes in the mother's immune system during pregnancy.
Oh, that's fascinating. So the more male fetuses a mother carries, the more her immune system responds. And that could alter the hormonal environment for later male fetuses. But again, it's really important to remember that these are just theories, and there's still a lot that we don't know about the complex interplay of biological and environmental factors that contribute to sexual orientation.
You are exactly right. This is a field with a lot of ongoing research, and while we are getting a better understanding, there are still a lot of unanswered questions and very exciting avenues to explore.
Wow, it is amazing how much ground we've covered already, from, hormones to brain structures to junk DNA. I feel like we're really starting to kind of unravel all these complexities of biology's role in sex and gender. But I have to admit, it's raising a lot more questions for me too. Like, how do we reconcile this biological understanding with all the social and cultural influences that shape our experiences of gender?
That's a really great point, and it highlights the importance of considering both nature and nurture when we are looking at this topic. It's not just one or the other. It's this complex interplay between our biology and our environment.
So it's like we are born with certain biological predispositions, but then society kind of layers on its own expectations and norms. It makes you wonder how much of what we see as gendered behavior is actually biological versus learned through socialization.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a fascinating area of research. A lot of researchers are trying to disentangle these influences of biology and culture on gender identity and expression. For example, some studies have looked at cross-cultural variations in gender roles and behaviors to try to figure out, what might be universal and what might be specific to certain cultures.
That makes sense. So if a behavior is truly biological, then we should see it consistently across different cultures, right? But if it's more of a cultural thing, it might look different depending on those societal norms and expectations.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is even when we do find some similarities in gendered behaviors across cultures, it doesn't automatically mean they are only determined by biology. It could be that certain biological things just make it more likely for cultures to develop certain gender roles, but those roles are still shaped and reinforced by social and cultural factors.
So it's this ongoing back and forth between biology and culture, where each one influences the other. It really makes you realize how complex gender is. I mean, it's not just about chromosomes or hormones, but also about societal expectations, personal experiences, and all those cultural influences.
Right. And as we keep learning more and more about the biology of sex and gender, it is so crucial that we use this knowledge responsibly and ethically. We need to be mindful of not reinforcing those harmful stereotypes or just reducing people down to their biology. Instead, we should be trying to create a more inclusive and understanding society that celebrates the diversity of human experiences.
Well said. I think this deep dive has been really eye-opening. It's challenged a lot of my own assumptions and given me a whole new perspective on how biology, society, and personal identity all intersect.
I'm so glad to hear that. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this exploration. We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you a much deeper understanding of this fascinating and always evolving world of sex and gender.